Lovely. All right. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Just waiting for a couple more people to come in from the waiting room.
Chris and I have been having a fantastic conversation. I'm sorry, you've missed all the gold we've been talking.
All the gossip, yeah.
Well, we'll get back into it. Lovely. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently speaking to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So before we begin tonight's discussion of award-winning author Chris Hammer's new crime thriller, Trust, I would just first like to quickly reiterate some of that information that you were sent in the email tonight with your link to join this event. So you have all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening. However, that doesn't mean that Chris isn't keen to answer your questions. He is, and we will be having a Q&A in the last 15 minutes or so of this event. So I ask that you start sending your questions to me using the chat box. If you can't see it right now, then it should be towards the lower left of your screen. But if it isn't, don't worry. I'm going to be posting the link to purchase your copies of Trust if you haven't done so already in that chat box, and so it will pop up when I do. You can type your questions there, they will come straight through to me and I will ask them for you towards the end of this event. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce Chris Hammer. Before becoming a writer, Chris was a journalist for more than 30 years and reported from over 30 countries on 6 continents for SBS TV. He is now a leading Australian crime fiction novelist. His new book, Trust, is the gripping new Martin Scarsden novel to follow his international bestsellers, Scrublands and Silver. In conversation with Chris tonight is Ben Hobson. Ben is the author of 2 novels. His debut, To Become a Whale, was longlisted for the ARBIA Debut Fiction Award and the Courier Mail's People Choice Award, and most recently, his most recent novel, Snake Island, was released in 2019. And so, Chris and Ben, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
All right, well, thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really nice. I'm just going to click on the little arrow so I can see all your nice faces. Hello. Welcome to tonight, and especially big welcome to Chris Hammer, one of the most gentlemanliest men I've ever had the pleasure of meeting, and a fantastic author. Welcome, Chris, to tonight's proceedings, and welcome to virtual Queensland.
Well, thank you from virtual Canberra. Lovely to be with you. And I can see we have a few authors in the house. Hello, Rob. Hello, Mark. Hello, any others I can't see further down. So it should be fun.
Yeah. I agree. I feel a little intimidated by their intellect, all these smart-looking people. So we're going to make these questions really nice, especially this first question, which I wrote down just today. So, Chris, I was talking to my son, Charlie, in the car this afternoon, and I said, tonight I'm interviewing a man named Chris Hammer. And he said, is he as tough as a hammer? And so my question for you, Chris, is, are you in fact as tough as a hammer?
No, nowhere near as tough as a hammer. However, I do get asked quite a bit whether it's my real name, which it is, but it is a good name for a crime writer, I figure. And also,
you've got Mandalay Blonde, right? So Mandalay Blonde is such a vivid name, and all your characters have Martin Scarsden. It sounds like you wrote your own name.
Yeah, well, that's what people accuse me of. In Germany, Hammer is often used as a sign of Das Hammer. It's like slang for it's great, or it's it's the bomb sort of thing. So
Das Hammer.
It's a pretty it's a good name to have there too, right?
Yes, I agree. It's a great name. It does sound like you made it up, and I'm not sure whether we accept your answer as being the full truth yet. We'll see. So I'd like to start, if it's okay with you, just a few questions about your process, if that's all right, before we move into the story of Trust. Trust, I think we're going to post some links a bit later on if you haven't purchased a copy of Trust yet, anyone in the audience. It is the third novel in the Martin Scarsden series, and it is a fantastic read. I think I read it. When you get a new Chris Hammer, you sort of have to put them up the top of your to-read pile. I don't know whether anyone else has that same thing that they do, because you know it's going to be one of those gripping reads that you'll get through at a pace. So then the to-be-read pile doesn't get obnoxiously big. You get through them nice and quick because they're just such a pace. I guess that's where I want to start with you, Chris. Trust has a unique kind of pace, and it's actually a little different from Scrublands and Silver. Are you able to talk about that a little bit, just the pace of this novel and how you got there, how you got that gripping read where you're just turning pages?
Yeah, so I think Trust, if Scrublands and Silver are page turners, I think Trust is even more of a page turner, and it's more dramatic, and it's probably a little bit, leans more to being a little bit more of a thriller than just a straight crime book like the first two. But none of that was deliberate. It wasn't like me making a decision, I'm going to write that sort of book. How it happened is, when I wrote Scrublands, I set out to write a cracking crime book. And I thought what I needed for that was a really good plot. That was the be-all and end-all of a good crime book. But as I wrote it, I was kind of learning on the job. I began to appreciate that there are many more things that are important for a good crime book, perhaps more important even than the plot. The setting, the character, the voice. And in the case of Scrublands, Martin's own kind of personal, emotional journey. So he ends up being a different man at the end of the book than at the start of the book. I like that myself, and I think it resonated with readers. And that's what then led to me in the second book, Silver, of Martin going back to his old hometown and having to learn and confront and reconcile with what the traumatic events that beset him and his family when he was a kid. And it was then again, as I was finishing Silver, I thought, hang on, what about Mandy? What about her story? And I realised from Scrublands, we know that she lived in that little town, Riversend, up until the time she left school, and then returned when she was about 28. So there's a 10-year gap. And I thought, okay, that's the starting point for this next book. And from there, it went, I thought, well, if she's running away from her terrible youth in this sort of rather abusive town, she's not going to go to another little town. You know, she's 18, she's in her early 20s, she's going to go to a city. Yep. So I decided, okay, she'll go to the city. So this book, it's less bush and more noir, if I can put it like that. But then that I had another problem then, in that the first two books are told pretty much exclusively from Martin Scarsden's point of view. You know, he's in every scene, you can read what he thinks, but nobody else. But while he can be reasonably sort of perceptive when it comes to picking up clues, you know, who did what to whom when sort of stuff, he's not very emotionally perceptive. So I was thinking, this isn't possible. He can't tell her story. Yeah. So then I thought I'd flip it and tell it from her point of view. But that had some issues too. So what happens in this book, the structure, there's 2 points of view, and they pretty much alternate chapter by chapter. One chapter from Martin, one chapter from Mandy, back to Martin, and so on. And it kind of as a consequence of that, the chapters have to be shorter because you want to keep them in sync. And it makes the book pacier. And because there's actually quite a lot of events happening, it's not just Martin and Mandy snooping around trying to work out what happened in the past. It's like the past has erupted, if you like. And it's like a big chain reaction. All these characters are reacting, and they're in the middle of it. So between that and the points of view, the effect is, yeah, it's a kind of a pacier book, but it's all as a consequence of that chain of effect, rather than me sitting down as a writer going, oh, I'm going to write a different sort of book, you know, like that.
Yeah, it's interesting, hey, because it sounds like, I mean, you can probably describe yourself, and I invite you to, between the idea of the plotter and the pantser. I'm sure most people are very familiar with those terms, but for those of you who don't know, generally authors try to maybe put themselves into a category. Do you just write how you feel the characters would react, or do you plot out the whole thing and, you know, have a whole wall full of cue cards about exactly what's going to happen in the plot? But it sounds like, Chris, that you're a bit more of a pantser, if you don't mind me saying so.
I am. So, look, sorry if I seemed a bit distracted, but we've just been hit by a hailstorm, and I can hear it rattling off the windows next to me. So if the light starts sort of, you know, flickering, you know what's happening.
It's scary if you just go black in the screen.
Yeah, I know, right. You have to call as long as you can hear me. I can hold up my phone and, you know, light myself by the phone.
Yes, okay, good.
So, yeah, there's these two groups, the two sort of polar ends of, particularly of crime writers, so the plotters, people who plot out, and sometimes at incredible length, like hundreds of pages, this complete treatment before they start the narrative. And I kind of like to do that because it sounds more efficient. But the trouble is, when I try, I get a better idea. Oh, would it be better? And often that has to do with the characters. Some characters might start just as a plot point. It's a transactional thing. Martin or Mandy needs to find out this, and this is the person who's going to tell them. But if you're going to have a character, why not make them interesting? So sinister or quirky or funny or whatever. And some of them then take on a life of their own, and they come back, you know, as you're writing the book, I know, they can come back and do that. And maybe they've been motivated by this or that. And so, yeah, the story tends to evolve as I write it. With Scrublands, as I say, I was kind of learning on the job. But because I kept on having better ideas, I threw out hundreds of thousands of words. So you get what I mean by it's not very efficient. And with Silver, I promised I wouldn't do that. But in the end, in the actual editing process, I got a better idea. So I ditched the last 40,000 words and rewrote the ending. I don't mean polish. I mean completely, you know, change things.
How did that feel? Like, did you mourn the loss? Did you burn paper in effigy? It was all right?
No, because it's not a different idea. It's a better idea.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so if it makes a better book, and that's all that matters. Now, we trust that didn't happen. So maybe I'm learning. Maybe I'm picking up earlier what's working and what's not working. So maybe some of the craft skills are getting a bit more refined.
And do you feel, and you know, with Martin in Scrublands and Silver, and then especially Mandalay and Martin as well in Trust, do you find that process is something that you go through in discovering who they are? So as you're writing about that 10-year gap for Mandalay, are you in the process of discovering it as we, the reader, are discovering it as well?
Yeah, in some ways. And characters, so Mandy going back, and sometimes it's hard to remember, you know, your chain of thought processes. Yeah. But Mandy's introduced very early on in Scrublands, and she started as this kind of trope, this beautiful woman in this desolate town. And the idea there was that readers were thinking, okay, we know what's going to happen here. He's going to end up rescuing her from this town. But in the end, well, without giving too much away, she rescues him, both literally and emotionally. So it's flipped around. And then, but she kept growing. She's quite a prominent character in that book. And so by now, yeah, they're very well kind of defined. They're well defined in my mind, with a possible exception of, I'm still not entirely sure what Martin looks like.
Is that on purpose so that, you know, we can imagine? No, okay.
No, so I didn't realise this until people often ask, who would you like to see play them in a TV show, right? And Mandy's described in quite a lot of detail at the start of Scrublands. You know, she's beautiful, she's young, she's blonde, she's got flawless skin, she's got green eyes, she's got dimples, she's got well-sculpted cheekbones, etc., etc. But what I realised in answering that question was, because the books are told from Martin's point of view, well, you don't describe yourself. No. And at one point in Scrublands, he's looking at himself in the mirror. But as we all do, when we look in the mirror, we don't describe ourselves. We know what we look like. We pick up on other things. So in Scrublands, he sees that he's bloodshot and he's sunburnt and he's looking a bit jowly and a bit worse for wear, rather than a description of what his hair colour is or something like that. So in a strange way, I know him really well, and I know his, you know, psyche and his emotions and whatever, and his psychological makeup, but I don't really know what he looks like.
You could have pulled a real fast one on everybody and had Mandalay describing him in Trust as just being this really ugly, sad sack, and, you know, just a completely different picture of how we pictured him.
There is a suggestion in Scrublands that he is or has been good looking, because there's a comparison made to the good looking and charismatic priest in Scrublands. So we know at least that much.
Yeah, that's how I've always pictured him too. Do you find it important, like as you're writing, do you find when you're like imagining a scene, are you picturing what everyone looks like specifically? Like how do you go about actually describing what's happening in a scene?
I'm quite visual. I think I sort of put myself in the scene, and the characters I'm almost channeling the characters. So for example, if I came up with a plot point where, for example, Martin shoots someone dead in cold blood, it's just not going to happen, because that's not who he is, right?
Yeah.
He's not always as pure as the driven snow, but that's be a bridge too far. And it's the same with many of the other characters too. Right from the start with Scrublands, I decided I didn't want a bunch of goodies and a bunch of baddies. So most of the characters are kind of nuanced. So even so in Trust, there's people who do some pretty awful things, but you kind of understand how they've gotten to that point. And so that's one time it can take off is I really enjoy writing dialogue, because I'm not sure where it's going to end up. And if you think about when you have a conversation in real life, no one plans out a conversation. If you meet someone for coffee, you don't say, okay, we've got 20 minutes, let's cover this, this, and this, like a formal agenda in a meeting. And so I'll be bouncing from being inside the head of one character to another character. And sometimes the dialogue just goes off in an unexpected direction, which is kind of true to life. But sometimes out of it comes an idea that really drives the story forward. So that's not always, but it can be a real fun thing as a writer.
Yeah, and I guess especially if you're going from that intuitive place, as long as you know the characters that well, anything that comes out of your subconscious is going to be things that they would say, because they're your characters and you know them. And so they're not going to start to talk about things that aren't true to who they are. And I guess that's just like real life. We don't think about every single word we say before we say it. So I like that idea of listening to the dialogue. Yeah, it's cool. Is that sort of your favorite part of writing? Like, I'm just interested in the process of it. Is your favorite part those? Yes, sorry.
I think maybe finishing is my favorite part. I
understand.
Look,
I understand.
Like most authors, you know, you'd say the editing process at the end when you're backwards and forwards and you're going over the same material. That's not that much fun, but it is really important. And particularly, you know, with editorial team at Allen and Unwin are fantastic. So you're working with really brilliant, talented, experienced people who are dedicated to making your book as good as it possibly can be. So you'd be rather churlish not to value that. And I've learned to enjoy that more. But I really like those days where you sit down and you're not quite sure what's going to happen, or you've got a problem and you really don't feel much like writing. And for whatever reason, sometimes they're the days where the magic happens and you end up, you know, a few hours later going, that was good. And, you know, you kind of know as a writer when you're struggling and or when, you know, you've written something that works well, that is going to stay in the book, you know, that readers will like, that drives the story forward, gives some sort of greater insight into the characters, whatever it is. And that's got to be my favorite part, I think.
It's such a weird thing, hey? It's so strange. Like, it's such a magic sort of process. Like you say, where you sit down and you don't know what's going to happen, and then 3 hours later, you're like, oh, I did a good job. Such a different thing from a lot of different you know, because I'm a high school teacher, I wouldn't go into a class and just go, all right, well, just see how we go.
It's very different from being a journalist. You know, hey, look what I just made up. You know?
I imagine it's very different. Speaking of intuitive scenes and describing and all that sort of stuff, I wanted to talk about, there is some gangbuster action scenes, I feel, in Trust. Some really cool dynamic action scenes, and I could just visualize it so well. I felt like I was there. I felt the bullets were flying past my head. How did you go about crafting those? Like, what was your sort of process in imagining those scenes and describing them in that sort of detail? Because I don't know, but I'm assuming you've never been under fire. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course.
I've been in a few hairy situations, put it that way, when I was a foreign correspondent, but nothing, you know, that correlates to the experience in the book. I think I visualized myself there, so it's a visual as well as being inside the mind of the characters. I think I benefit from the years when I was doing long form television current affairs. So when you're writing for television like that, you're writing almost in 3 dimensions. You're writing the bits that your script that you're going to narrate, right?
Yeah.
But then there's the pictures, and then there's the natural audio and what people say, you know, in interviews. And also you can add music and sound effects. So, and often the secret to a really good TV script like that is the less you say as the narrator and the more that events unfold on screen, the better, the more impactful it is. And I think maybe I've picked up some of that. The other thing too with broadcast is you do have to tell a story, because people can't go back and read the paragraph again in the same way they can in a newspaper or a magazine. So I think maybe there might be a little bit of that influence, but I agree there's some scenes in my books that I like myself. So for example, in Scrublands, there's a very dramatic scene when Martin and a couple of others are trapped in a house during a bushfire. Again, nothing I've actually experienced personally, but good to imagine and good to have it an effect. And sometimes the scenes, and there are some pretty confrontational, violent scenes in Trust, but also there's some scenes where you give them a flavour or an atmosphere where it's not about action and it's not about violence. It's more, you know, what's going on internally. And if you can make one of those scenes work, that it's just not a transactional scene that advances the plot, but you make it into something of a vignette or something. Yeah, afterwards you go, yeah, that's good. That works. That advances a whole lot of different things, but it's fun to read in its own right.
Yeah. So sort of hitting that balance. Let's turn to Trust now and have a bit of a chat about just what happens in Trust. You start with this really, really interesting prologue, and you introduce some really vibrant characters in that prologue. Can you tell us a little bit about that prologue and just what you were aiming at with it? Yeah.
All right. What I'll do is I'll just talk about the first chapter first. So there's a short prologue.
Sure.
There's the first chapter. And in the first chapter, we pick up Martin and Mandy. They're living up on the north coast of New South Wales, where we leave them at the end of Silver. Now, I should say, too, at this point, you don't have to have read Scrublands or Silver to read Trust. I was interviewed by someone earlier today who just read Trust and just loved it and now wants to go back and read the others. Anyway, they're up on the coast. Martin gets a phone call. It's Mandy screaming. The call cuts off. He races back to the house. She's been abducted and there's an unconscious policeman on the floor, and Martin shortly after learns that a body of an undercover policeman has been uncovered in Sydney, who's killed, they think, 5 years ago, when everybody had thought that this guy had actually just stolen a lot of money and escaped overseas. Then we have Mandy's point of view, and Mandy's been kidnapped, and she's convinced that it's the past that's come after her, that she's been in denial. She hasn't told Martin anything about her past, or these specific events in her past, which is where the title of the book, Trust, comes in. She hasn't trusted him enough to tell him. She's hoping it's just all buried and won't be revisited. And now he's thinking, can I trust her? She hasn't told me any of this. So the prologue sets the scene of what was unfolding 5 years ago. So it's a sort of, so it almost gives you two reasons to keep reading the book. The prologue in that first chapter. Both of those, I mean, you hook us in with that mystery about what exactly is happening, because there's a few things not completely resolved, especially in that prologue. And then the chapter where you get the phone call and she screams and then it's cut off and she's kidnapped. I mean, I think what I write down happens on page 10. So it's just such a vibrant, interesting way to start a story. Go on. Sorry, did you want to say something? No. Keep going.
Now, when we get to Martin, so Martin, when you introduce him at the start of Trust, he's very different to when you introduced us to him in Scrublands, and we've gone on a journey with this character. How would you describe his change over the course of the novels? He's changed a lot, I think.
He's grown a lot emotionally. He's become a lot more self-aware. He's healed a lot. So the events in Trust, the events in Silver take place within weeks of the events in Scrublands, but Trust is a year and a half, 2 years down the track, and they've been living a life up on the coast. And an important part of Martin's growth is it's clear he has got a great deal of love for Mandy's son, Liam, his stepson, if you like. Not his biological child, but it's made him much more not as selfish and more giving. So he's he's been able to heal a lot, and he's very reluctant to go back to Sydney. So the book is set in Sydney, and we can certainly talk about why, quite apart from, you know, Mandy's past. But he'd lived there for 20 years when he was a journalist, and he's reluctant to go back. And part of that is he doesn't want to pick up that life, that sort of empty, emotionally empty life. But the thing about him is once he gets there, and once he starts digging, and once he starts learning what's going on, he just can't help himself. The old journalist in him comes out, and he realizes that there's this absolutely cracking story. And the thing about him, the reason why he's been able to leave journalism, like daily journalism, I mean, apart from the fact that Mandy's quite wealthy, is he's sort of carved out a career writing true crime books on the background of what's happened to him in Scrublands and Silver. So it's a neat little circle there.
Yeah. It's sort of like he's mining material a little bit all the time. As you say, Martin is a journalist, and he has been a journalist for a very long time. So he mirrors you in a lot of ways with that. And I think something that Michael Connolly does well with his journalist characters and his background as well is there's a lot of discussion about the ethics of journalism and the priority of the story over the people. Is that something that you enjoy sort of talking about in these books as well, through Martin's point of view?
Yeah, it touches on. I'm not trying to lecture or be didactic or anything like that. It just almost kind of creeps into the narrative subconsciously. One thing that is in this book is Martin is, as I say, you know, he's changed. He doesn't really want to be that journalist anymore. And yet on the other hand, when he's in Sydney, he becomes at times rather nostalgic for the glory days, you know, of working on the Sydney Morning Herald, back when it had resources, back when, you know, he was a young cadet and it looked like the world was his oyster, and, you know, he's traveling and all of that. And there is like a little bit of a homage, if you like, to the great days of newspapers and the great days of the media in Australia, because of course, you know, the business model, newspapers, commercial television, the ABC, everyone's under the sort of pressures that they weren't, you know, 20 years ago. So there's a little bit of wistfulness and sadness on behalf of Martin too. Yeah,
interesting. A big part of trust, I feel, and you mentioned it a little earlier, was this idea of grappling with our pasts and trying to keep things pushed down and away from the people we love. And I guess I'm just sort of awkwardly trying to ask you about your personal idea about this idea of keeping things from the people you love. Do you think that that's something that's possible to do, or do you think it's something that's right to do? I mean, I know this is a tricky question, but it seems to always come back to bite people, this idea of trying to keep things hidden. And I was just wondering, but at the same time, you know, Martin, I don't know, what do you think? What do you think, Chris?
I'm not sure I want to give an answer to that, because I want people to read the books and think about it. But right from the word go, in Scrublands, Mandy starts asking Martin whether he believes in karma and he believes in fate. And it becomes pretty apparent through the three books that she is a bit preoccupied by this idea of karma, that if you've done bad things, that they will come back and you know, you can't escape them. And that's part of her view of the world. And it's almost like there's a conflict there. Part of it just wants to keep all this bad stuff, if you like, buried.
Yeah.
But another part of her And a lot of her rationale for that is it's almost as if she realizes it can be damaging to her, but that it's worth it if it protects her son. So she says to Martin,
right.
we're the ones, we've got to keep the past from affecting him. So it's not, hopefully it's not laid on too thick, but it's certainly
definitely.
Certainly there.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think it's laid on thick at all. I was also wondering just about some of the very, very vibrant side characters in Trust. You've got some really vibrant baddies. I guess you'd call them baddies, but at the same time, you give them nuance, like you say, and motivation. So they're not just mustache twirling. They've got a bit of interest to them. What can you tell us about some of these side characters and how you go about crafting them? Do they spring out at you from intuition, or do you go ahead.
So there are big lightning flash. Can you hear the thunder?
No, but this is kind of the most exciting, I think, interview I've ever done.
Good microphone. So there are some returning characters, and that's been a really enjoyable part of the book. So the police return. Morris Montefiore and his offsider, Ivan Lukic, and there's some of the journalists. There's Darcy Defoe from the Herald, and there's Doug Funkleton, the rather obtuse television reporter. I
love his name so much.
Mandy's fierce solicitor, Winifred Barbican. So there's returning characters like that, but there is pretty much a new cast of baddies. But as you say, they've got different motivations, and they're not all on the same side. Put it that way. They have, all of them have kind of competing interests, which ends up making the plot rather interesting and leads to some kind of unexpected developments. Put it that way. As I say, this sort of time bomb of events explodes. So there's a character called Henry Livingston, who we haven't met before, and he's a tough guy. He's a standover man. He's a killer, but he dresses immaculately in vintage suits and oils his hair with California poppy, and carries an enormous kind of like Wild West revolver. It's kind of like as if Wild Bill Hickok has appeared in the streets of Sydney, minus the spurs maybe. But he's also, the way he acts is a little bit kind of cryptic. It's never really obvious, even when he's talking, what he's actually talking about. And so he ended up being a really good fun character, right? And with his own kind of strong emotional story, and some of the bad guys have that, so that's good.
He's a standout character, I feel, and he's kind of terrifying when you introduce him. And you become afraid of when he will reappear, and then what he'll do when he'll reappear. He seems
he's on a hair trigger.
Yeah, exactly. How did you go about, I mean, obviously, if you can't answer this without spoiling, we'll just skip the question. But someone like Henry and all the other motivations in the story, everyone in the secret society and, all the different people. This is more of a writer question, but how do you go about getting us to understand what motivates them without them just monologuing like in a James Bond, where like, ha, have you captured now, Bond, and I will put you in the tank? And
that's kind of a good question, because again, in Trust, it doesn't have the tight point of view of just Martin as in Scrublands and Silver. There's two points of view, but they are equally as tight. So the only way that Martin and Mandy can find out, and hence the only way the readers can find out about what's motivating the characters, is only by what they say and what they do. You don't see inside their head. So I guess it can be a bit tricky. One of the things you can do as a writer, I like this as a reader, when you know what's happened, but it's not clearly stated why, and that leaves room for the imagination of the reader. You don't want to over-inform people. It's nice, you know, I like those books where sometimes I just put it down for a while and have a little think about what's happening. And I especially like those books that when you finish, you know, it gives you pause to, you know, think for a little bit about what's happened, because your imagination is going. And that's really the great creative side of reading. You know, there's the two bits. There's the bit that you and I do as the writer. That's part of the creative process. But the reader, it's almost like no reader reads the same book, because it's filtered through their own experience and their own imagination, and, you know, where they are and what mood they're in and stuff. So it's nice if you leave a bit of space there for readers to imagine for themselves.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that answer. It's sort of like you've written a script and then every reader gets to be their own director of the film in their heads.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You do that a bit too, like with the action scenes. And something I really like in your books is like something drastic will happen. And then while it's happening, it's a bit confusing to us about like, why is that person doing it? He's here and and then afterwards you have Martin and other characters kind of investigate the motivations and try to figure out what happened and put that puzzle together themselves. I really like that technique. I think you do a really good job of that.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think it's important when you have action or you have violence that there are kind of real consequences of that. I don't like those sort of books where, you know, that the hero, you know, James Bond, like, you know, shoots half a dozen people dead and all you get is a sort of a smart ass quip or something. It's like, I'm going, you know, it's just a bit too escapist for me. I mean, I get it. And I'm sure I've watched movies and that where I've really enjoyed it, but not when I'm writing, maybe.
Yeah, not your sort of book. I understand. We might open it up to questions just in a second. So if you've got anything you want to ask Chris while he's in the hot seat, please type it into the chat window. But my last question is, Chris, what's next for Martin? Have you got any new adventures that you're thinking he might set out on, or how have you been thinking now that you've had this book out for like a few weeks? When do I get my next book, Chris?
Yeah, right. No, well, I have been thinking about it because I do think it's important once you finish a book to move on and start working on something new. And part of that is just, it's an efficient way of working, I guess, but I think it's psychologically important too. I'm fine when I'm writing the books, that's no problem, in editing, but just the week or two before publication date, I get really anxious and nervous, which is stupid because there's, you know, they're already printed. There's nothing you can do about it, right? But it does help if you've kind of moved on. You know, someone says, oh, this is a terrible book. You can always say, yeah, but wait till you read the one I'm writing now, sort of thing.
Yeah.
One of my problems, I've become very, you know, fond of Martin and Mandy, although people do say to me, how can you possibly put them through all those awful things? My problem with taking them forward, though, is this. I think an important part of the book so far has been that kind of emotional journey. It's an important thread in the books. So just to write a book with them in as protagonists, where there's nothing at stake for them emotionally, I'm not sure that would work, and it wouldn't be kind of fair to the readers. If they'd started out like that, and there's plenty of detectives who are like that, you know, just straightforward police procedurals, or, you know, your Agatha Christie sort of Miss Marple or Poirot, who are quite sort of objective and not emotionally involved so much. You can write several books like that. But I'm wondering, so I'm thinking, I'm not sure what storyline I'd have that would have that emotional impact.
Yeah.
So I think I will definitely come back to them. But what I'm thinking now is I might write a book with a different point of view character or characters, but set, if you like, in the same universe. And by that,
yes.
I mean, what I mean by that is like contemporary Australia, but with some of those recurring minor characters. Maybe they're the major characters, and who knows, maybe Martin and Mandy are in it, but not as point of view characters. Maybe they just have a little cameo at some stage, or, you know, the main character's reading the newspaper, or the latest Martin Scarsden true crime book or something like that.
That's
so anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking at the moment. But let's see. Hopefully this time next year, as opposed to this time in 5 years' time, we can talk about it.
Absolutely. I don't know whether you've ever heard this quote. Something I always think about when what you were discussing. The director Sidney Lumet, I think he was quoted as saying, "You can shoot a film and tell a story of people falling in love for 2 hours, or you can shoot the film of them falling out of love for 2 hours, but you can't just have them in love for 2 hours because no one's gonna. That's not dramatically interesting."
Yeah, I've heard something similar. You can't start a story with "they lived happily ever after."
No. As much as, I don't know, kind of wouldn't mind reading Martin and Mandy just hanging out, having a nice life. Liam goes to school, gets his first report card, it's all A's. I don't know. Maybe that's just in my head that I can have that book happen. We'll open it up to questions now, Emma, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, Chris. We have had several questions come through. A couple of them have been double ups, and a couple have now been answered. So if you do have any more, I think I'll be able to fit them in. So send them through if you have any others for me. But let's start with one of the ones that I've had a couple of times. Few people, Danielle, Ruben, want to know how you come up with your characters' flamboyant names. How have you come up with them?
Yeah, the name thing. And
your own name, Chris, your own name as well. How did you come up with that?
Yeah. So rewind a few years ago when I was writing Scrublands. I was writing it in my spare time, and I was writing it very much, not exactly as a hobby, but for my own satisfaction, because I'd written a couple of non-fiction books that were well received, but didn't sell very much. And so I thought when I was writing this book, Scrublands, that maybe I'd get it published, but it wouldn't go anywhere. So I think I just got bored at times. So I started playing around with a few things, much of which ended up being really useful, I think, because I wasn't trying to impress publishers, because I wasn't trying to impress readers. The book was probably more original than it might otherwise have been. But I started having these really sort of Dickensian, outlandish names, Martin Scarsden, Harley Snouch, Winifred Barbican, Byron Swift, etc. And it was only after Scrublands was published and doing really well that I started getting a bit sort of feeling a bit awkward about this, that I'd kind of over-egged it a little bit, until I was at an event one night and a woman came up and said to me, "Oh yeah, I just love your names. They're fantastic." And I was kind of, being a bit sheepish thinking, and she goes, "No, your plots are really quite complex." And this is true. I mean, in all the books, there's 4 or 5 different plot lines all kind of interwoven together. And she said, "But because your names are so distinctive, I don't have to go back and reread and work out who's who." And it was kind of a bit of an epiphany for me, in that as a reader, that happens to me all the time, particularly if I've put a book down and haven't picked it up for a week, or, there's a lot of characters with very, Anglo, Tom, Dick, Harry sort of names, or, whatever. And I thought, what, I think she's right. And so maybe not quite as outlandish, or maybe they are, but anyway, I thought, look, I'll stick with it. So there's a few things like that I kind of, I guess, grew a bit fond of. Another thing is, while I think of it, the first two books, Scrublands and Silver, are set in two really absolutely fictional towns. Maybe the landscapes are quite real, but the towns themselves. And so in the book, in the front of the book, there are maps to show the readers, you know, where things are. But when there's Trust is set in Sydney, but we've got a map in the front of the book, and it's a fantastic map by the same artist. And the events in Trust take place within a tight time frame, about a week or so, but also just in a particular part of Sydney. That it's sort of like the inner city and the inner eastern suburbs. Is, you know, it's not picture postcard Sydney. It's not the harbour and the Opera House and Bondi Beach. It's quite narrow. So the names and the maps I decided I like. So they're there again.
Thank you. We actually had a question to do with the setting. I'm trying to find it now, but a few have come through. It was something along the lines of, did you feel that there was any risk in moving from rural noir to the city?
Not really once I got the story going, but I did wonder how I was going to do it, and because the settings are important in my books. And in Scrublands and Silver, I kind of had a free hand to imagine what the setting was and what the weather was and that. And then I realised, even though the book's set in Sydney, I've got no real obligation to describe Sydney as it is or describe it objectively. It can be just as atmospheric as an imagined setting. And if you think about it, if you think of all the books that you've read set in London or New York, none of them are set in a sort of a impartially observed New York. They all have a certain take, you know. It could be gangs fighting in the Bronx, or it could be Bonfire of the Vanities, or it could be, you know, Great Gatsby, you know, off in the Hamptons or wherever it is. So the Sydney in this book is atmospheric. It's set immediately post-COVID, which is another story I can explain if you like. But it's a big problem a lot of writers are facing at the moment. What do you do about COVID? Because, you know, there's a big gap between the time you finish the book and it comes out. So this is set post-COVID. There's been bushfires. There's a couple of days where Sydney's engulfed by bushfire smoke. The economy is still struggling to get on its feet. So it is a particularly, so it's a kind of a noiry take, I guess, on Sydney. So hopefully it's just as atmospheric as the settings in the first two books.
What is next? Nora has said, oh wait, sorry, actually, we'll go with Poppy first. Poppy has asked whether any of your friends or colleagues have ever thought that one of your characters might be based on them.
Yeah, they all do. But none of them are. I've got one friend who thinks Codger Harris is based on him. I mean, why you'd want to lay claim to that is beyond me. Some of the journalists are kind of amalgamations of vaguely of people I've known, but certainly not based on any particular person. No, they're not based on real people at all. And a lot of the events in the book, in the books, have just bubbled up somehow from the subconscious. And yet, there's a couple that are deliberately sort of found in the news. So in Trust, this body of this undercover policeman is found. Well, he's found in a dodgy apartment block in Sydney that's splitting open, and they x-ray the foundations and they find a body. Well, this has been happening. I don't know how aware in Brisbane you'd be of this, but over the last couple of years, there's been all these dodgy apartment blocks in Sydney where the poor people who live there had to be evacuated because these massive cracks start appearing in the walls. So that sort of thing, I guess, is based in truth. The other thing about the plot line in this book and why it kind of works in Sydney is it's about organised crime. It's about money laundering. It's about conspiracy. It's about political influence. And, you know, for want of a better expression, the old school tie and the influence of elites. So it is a, you know, what better place to set a book like that than Sydney, right? It's not, you couldn't take this plot and put it in a country town. It just wouldn't work. In the same way, the plot from Scrublands wouldn't work in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane. So the plot and the characters and whatever, they belong where they are.
Thank you. Nora has asked whether you miss journalism and would a great story lure you back?
You know, not really. Mainly, I must say, because I'm having so much fun with what I'm doing. I really like being a writer. I like the actual process of writing. I do have a lot of my friends are journalists and former journalists. I live in Canberra, so I run into political journalists and politicians and staffers and that all the time. And sometimes if there's a big, you know, I'd love, you know, COVID aside, I'd like to be, you know, in America now covering their presidential election. So sometimes when there's a big story, I miss it a bit. But all in all, no, I'd much prefer to be where I am now. After all, I just get to make stuff up. And I don't have to worry about defamation. I don't have to worry about contempt of court or contempt of parliament. I don't have to protect my sources. I don't have to fight for space in the paper. And best of all, at the end of the story, I can explain everything that happened. And so often in journalism, you don't know. And if you do know, you can't write it anyway because of the legal situation in Australia. So no, I'm happy where I am.
Thank you. And so for the last question, Mark is curious as to what your experience has been like launching this book during COVID as opposed to your other launches.
Yeah, so for the first part of the year, you know, when we went through that first period of lockdown and that, I would have been in lockdown anyway. So that didn't really affect me. But at this point, when you bring out a book, you often tour around if you're fortunate. I've been fortunate in the past. And you go to writers' festivals, which are great fun because you get to meet other writers. You know, there's the stuff you do on stage, but when you go and have a drink and a meal and whatever, it's quite sociable. So I miss all of that. But one, living in Canberra, a bit like being in Brisbane, life has been pretty normal. Two, whatever minor inconveniences there are as a writer, it's nothing compared to, say, a musician or an actor, you know, or people in performing arts. It's nothing compared to people in small business who've, you know, are really struggling. Nothing compared to, of course, to people who've lost their jobs. So, you know, maybe it hasn't been the best of years, but I think I should be grateful for how lucky I am rather than complaining about any sort of minor inconveniences. Specifically on the question, though, instead of traveling around and doing events, I've been doing a lot of these Zoom events, which are kind of terrific. And I think they've been really useful, particularly for people living in regional areas. You know, if you live in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, you can probably go to an author's event, you know, once a week at least. But if you live in the bush, it can be quite difficult. So in some ways, I'm hoping that once we do get back to normal, we'll still be able to have these kind of Zoom events. Or, you know, if Ben and I are on stage somewhere talking to each other, it's also being streamed for people who can't get to the venue. So I think there's been some upsides and not just downsides.
Thank you. Well, Chris and Ben, unfortunately, that is us out of time. That's the whole hour gone already. Thank you both so much for a great conversation. I've had several comments coming through the chat box from the audience, thanking you both as well. Unless there are any last comments that you would like to make, I think I will give everybody the option of unmuting themselves so that you can all join me in thanking Chris and Ben for tonight's discussion. So before I do that, any last comments?
The only thing I would say is support your local bookstores. Some are doing well, some aren't. They're really important to the ecosystem, the literary ecosystem in Australia. They're what joins us writers to readers, and they champion Australian authors so brilliantly. So if you can, yeah, support your local bookstore and avid reader, of course.
I would suggest buying this book as well if you're able to. I don't just recommend it because he's in the chat. I mean, that's awkward, but it's a genuinely good book. So please make sure you go out and buy it. And yeah, like Chris said, support your local bookstores, absolutely. And just, yeah, thank you, Chris and Avid, for hosting us.
Thank you. Thank you both. The link is in that chat box if you haven't followed it already to grab your copies. And now you can all take yourselves off mute to join me in thanking Chris and Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a lovely rest of the evening.
Thank you.
And you Victorians, Melburnians, Rob and Mark, good to see you. And hope to see you in person soon.
Good.
Thanks. Good night.